I don't do a production line with these pieces when I stitch. I work in pairs, 2 at a time, so I never forget where each particular one goes and where the curve's going to go to match the other curves. So we take the first pair, we put the 2 sides together for stitching, put a pin a half an inch from the beginning as we did before, and we're going to stitch these. Once I finish stitching this, I'll iron it, put it back here, then I'll go for the next pair, and then I'll join the 2 pairs together, and then I'll go for the next 2 pairs and again join them together. And now we're going to do the stitching, take it to the machine and stitch it just as before. As we did before, sometimes we need to keep the needle down, lift the foot and continue stitching, having repositioned the fabric. Now I'm going to iron this to make sure that it lies flat. And it lies flat just like before. I now have stitched the second pair, and I'm going to join those together to form the square again. We'll pin it as we did before, take it to the machine and stitch it again. Now we have quite a big curve here, so we've got to stop and rearrange it. Now we have a square, which when stitched, it actually becomes a rectangle. Now I have completed the first square, and I'm going to do the second one. I have now stitched the second piece of fabric. Now you can see there are 2 rectangles there with stripes. Now we're going to put them on top of each other again, and we must make sure that the colors alternate, because that's how we're going to get our checkerboard. If I were to put it this way round, with the colors coinciding, I would not get the effect I'm looking for. So you must make sure when you slide them over, you can see in fact that this shape is the same as that shape and that, like that. So you line them up, shape over shape, and colors contrasting. Right sides up, of course. Now we'll turn them round, and I'm going to look, and I can see that these edges are not actually straight. Well, they're never straight, but these edges are never absolutely coinciding. So I'm going to take my cutter and just make sure they're both the same. Only on one side, the side I'm going to start cutting from. Is simply a way of starting stitching from an even point conveniently. Now we cut in the same way as before, starting from the center, a nice curved seam. And again, halfway the 1/2. And halfway the other half. And now again, we separate them and alternate them, so you get the one from below. And now the checkerboard is taking shape. You will notice 2 things. One is the curves coincide perfectly, and so do the corners. But in fact, it won't stay like that when you stitch them. And you can also see that these edges are not exact, even if you start with a square, and that's perfectly normal. And now I'm going to stitch them together, and you will notice, in fact, they will become a square again, but they will be much smaller than the original squares that I started from. I'm going to stitch them in pairs just like I did before, and then iron them and put them back in their place. I'm now going to iron the seam I've just stitched, then I'm going to stitch the other pair, then join those two pairs together, iron it at every stage, and then I'm going to repeat the procedure with the second piece. I've got my squares on the cutting mat now, and I'll show you what to do next. I've got my two squares now. You can see they've gone back to square, but they're a lot smaller than they were to start with. You can also see they've got rather ragged edges, and they also, the corners don't always coincide perfectly, but that's normal. That is the way this technique works, because you always have to add seam allowances which weren't there before. Now, if I want to join these two pieces together, if I join them like this, you can see the colors coincide, and that's not what I'm looking for. So you actually need to turn one of them 90 degrees, and then you will have colors coinciding. You might decide that in this particular case, the sections don't match so well, so you can try turning them a different way and seeing if you prefer it that way, or that way, or that way. I think I'm going to stick to this particular way. It is very important that you don't succumb to the temptation of cutting every square neatly trimmed back to the square, because we're actually going to use the ragged edges to build another curve. So we use the bit that sticks out to pull out, and then come back and take in the bit that pulls in. Now we're going to use the technique I showed you very briefly before. You're going to overlap the curve that you've cut onto the other half, and then copy it by following that curved line. And now we can stitch them together. And here's your checkerboard. And you can see that by joining it with a curved seam, you maintain that nice curved feeling of it. And do not trim all the edges, leave them until you know what you're going to do with the piece. You might want to join it to another piece with a nice curved line. Now I'm going to show you one other technique, which is going to be the last one today, and that is a variation on log cabin. Most people know what a log cabin is. It's basically a square which is surrounded by strips in different ways. You have a slightly larger one here, and we're just going to build a little one, but we're going to use curves to show you how you put them together.